Dad left a second will. I found it years ago and I never told you. My son said those words on Christmas Eve, just as I was setting the turkey on the dining room table. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Because what happened that night forced me to question everything I thought I knew about my husband, my son, and the family I had spent a lifetime protecting. The house smelled of cinnamon, pine, and roasted sweet potatoes. I had been up since 7 that morning, moving slowly from kitchen to dining room, checking the oven, polishing the silver, folding napkins into neat triangles the way Thomas used to like. At 71, I no longer moved as quickly as I once did, but I still took pride in making Christmas feel like Christmas. Especially after losing him. Thomas had been gone for almost 2 years, but Christmas still felt like something I was doing for him. I hung the same green wreath on the front door. I set out the ceramic angels he bought me in Vermont. I placed his favorite brass candle holders on the mantel, even though one of them leaned slightly to the left. Some things were too familiar to replace. His reading glasses were still on the small bookshelf beside the fireplace. I had tried moving them once. I got as far as the hallway closet before my chest tightened, and I carried them back like they were something alive. Some people call that grief. I think it was love refusing to leave quietly. Jacob arrived at 5:30 with Claire beside him. My son was 43 now, with gray beginning to show near his temples, but whenever he stepped through my front door, I still saw the little boy who used to run into my kitchen with scraped knees and impossible questions. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he said, hugging me. His hug was warm but brief. Claire kissed my cheek without quite touching it. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor. The house looks lovely." She always called me Eleanor. Never Mom. Never even Mrs. Parker anymore. Just Eleanor in that smooth, careful voice of hers, polite enough that no one could call it disrespectful, distant enough that I always felt the space between us. As I adjusted the place settings, I noticed something strange. The chair that had always belonged to Thomas had been moved. It was no longer at the head of the table. Claire had placed it near the wall and replaced it with one of the newer dining chairs from the kitchen set. A small potted poinsettia sat where my husband used to sit. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody asked how I felt about it. It was a small thing. But grief often arrives through small things. I stood there with a serving spoon in my hand, staring at that plant with its red leaves bright beneath the chandelier, and told myself not to be foolish. Chairs were just chairs. Rooms changed. People moved things. Christmas did not have to remain frozen forever just because I was not ready to let go. Still, when Jacob pulled out the chair beside me instead of his father's old seat, something tightened inside my chest. Dinner began quietly. The kind of quiet that pretends to be peaceful. Claire complimented the turkey. Jacob asked whether the furnace had been making that strange noise again. I told him it only rattled in the mornings, mostly when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. He nodded and said he would take a look sometime, the same way he had been saying for 6 months. Claire poured sparkling cider into the glasses before I could reach the bottle. "We don't want you doing too much," she said lightly. I smiled. "I've been doing Christmas dinner since before you were born, dear." Her smile stayed in place. "Of course. I just meant at your age it's good to let people help. At your age." 3 simple words. Softly spoken. Sharp enough to leave a mark. Jacob looked down at his plate. That was something I had started noticing after Thomas died. Whenever Claire said something that made the room colder, Jacob suddenly became interested in his fork, his napkin, his water glass, anything except my face. I used to think he was embarrassed. Later, I wondered if silence had simply become easier for him. Every time Jacob started to say something personal, Claire seemed to redirect the conversation. Not rudely, just enough. When he mentioned an old Christmas morning from childhood, Claire interrupted to ask whether I had considered replacing the stair railing. When he asked if I still heard from our old neighbors, she reminded him about a holiday party at her sister's house. When I told him I had found a box of his father's old letters in the attic, Claire reached for the cranberry sauce and said, "We should really talk about practical things tonight." Practical things. I looked at Jacob then. His shoulders had gone stiff. "Practical things?" I asked. Claire set the serving spoon down with careful precision. Jacob cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, After dinner, there's something I need to talk to you about. The room seemed to shrink around us. I glanced toward the Christmas tree, its lights blinking softly beside the front window. Thomas and I had bought that tree the first year Jacob went away to college. He had said the house felt too empty without something bright in the corner. Now the lights reflected in the dark glass like tiny warnings. What kind of something? I asked. Jacob opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire looked at him. Not a glance. A signal. I saw it. Maybe I had seen those looks before and chosen not to understand them. We should sit by the fireplace, Jacob said. The food will get cold. It can wait. That was when I knew. Not what he was going to say. Only that whatever it was had already been decided without me. I wiped my hands on my apron, though they were clean, and followed them into the living room. The fire had burned low. One log had collapsed into glowing red pieces, sending up a faint smell of smoke and cedar. Jacob sat on the sofa. Claire remained standing near the mantel. I sat in Thomas's old armchair because no one had moved that yet. For a while nobody spoke. Even the holiday music from the kitchen sounded too loud. Claire lowered her eyes. I felt my pulse in my fingertips. For one strange second I wondered whether someone was sick. Whether Jacob had lost his job. Whether there was a debt I did not know about. Whether Claire was pregnant and afraid to tell me for some reason I could not imagine. The truth never crossed my mind. Jacob leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mom, there's something I've been keeping from you for years. My hands folded in my lap. I remember that clearly. How still they looked. How old? What is it? His voice lowered. Dad left a second will. The fire cracked softly. Claire closed her eyes. I stared at my son. No, I said. It was not an argument. It was the only word my mind could find. Jacob swallowed. I found it after he died. I heard the wind moving against the windows. I heard the old house settling. I heard the clock in the hallway ticking with cruel steadiness. You found it, I repeated. He nodded. And you never told me? His face changed then. Not enough for a stranger to notice. But I was his mother. I saw the shame pass over him like a shadow. I thought I was doing the right thing. For whom? He did not answer. Claire did. Eleanor, Jacob was trying to protect you. There it was. That word again. Protect. A word people use when they have already taken your choice away. I turned to her slowly. From my own husband's will? Her lips pressed together. Jacob rubbed both hands over his face. I wasn't ready to deal with it, he said. There was so much happening after Dad passed. The funeral, the paperwork, the house, everything. You were grieving. I was grieving. Claire thought. He stopped. Claire's eyes sharpened. I waited. Sometimes silence asks better questions than words. Jacob looked down. Claire thought it would only upset you. I felt something inside me go very quiet. Not calm. Quiet. There is a difference. Where is it now? I asked. Jacob looked toward the hallway, then back at me. I have a copy. A copy? Yes. And the original? His throat moved. I don't know. The words landed softly, but they did not feel soft. I looked at the Christmas tree again. At the ornaments Thomas and I had collected over 42 years of marriage. A tiny glass church from Maine. A wooden sled Jacob made in second grade. A silver star Thomas bought me after his first big promotion because he said every tree deserved something that caught the light. My life was hanging there in pieces. And somehow, somewhere beneath all those familiar things, another life had existed. A hidden one. One where my husband wrote a second will. One where my son found it. One where my daughter-in-law knew enough to stand by the fireplace looking guilty. And I had been left outside of it. When? I asked. Jacob looked confused. When what? When did you find it? His voice was barely above a whisper. 3 weeks after the funeral. I closed my eyes. 3 weeks. 3 weeks after I stood beside my husband's grave wearing the black coat he hated because he said it made me look too serious. 3 weeks after I came home and found his slippers still beside the bed. 3 weeks after I forgot how to sleep through the night because every sound in the house reminded me he was not there to hear it. 3 weeks after I was still writing thank you notes to people who had sent casseroles and sympathy cards. My son had found something important enough to change our family. And he had said nothing. I opened my eyes. Claire had moved closer to Jacob now, one hand resting lightly on the back of the sofa behind him. Protective. Possessive. I was not sure which. What did it say? I asked. Jacob's face tightened. I can't explain all of it tonight. A strange laugh almost escaped me. I held it back. You came to my house on Christmas Eve to tell me you hid your father's will for years, but you can't explain it tonight? I know how that sounds. Do you? He flinched. Good. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Because I needed to know there was still something in him that could be hurt by what he had done. Claire spoke again. We thought Christmas might be the right time because family is together. I looked around the room. The three of us. One empty chair. One dead husband. One hidden will. This is not together, I said quietly. Nobody answered. The fire dropped lower. For a moment I saw Jacob as a child again, standing in our old kitchen with chocolate on his shirt, afraid to admit he had broken the blue mixing bowl. Thomas had knelt beside him and said, "Son, mistakes get worse when you hide them." Jacob had cried then. He was not crying now. That hurt more than I expected. Finally he said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. Too small for the room. Too late for the years behind them. I nodded once. Not because I accepted the apology. Because I had reached the edge of what I could safely say without breaking. "Bring me the copy," I said. Jacob looked at Claire. I saw it again. That reflex. That tiny consultation. The humiliation of it burned hotter than anger. "I am your mother," I said. "You do not need permission to answer me." His face went pale. Claire's hand dropped from the sofa. For the first time that night, she looked at me as if she had underestimated something. Good. Jacob stood slowly. "I'll bring it tomorrow." "No," I said. "You'll bring it tonight." "Mom." "Tonight." My voice did not rise. It did not need to. Something in the room shifted. Jacob nodded. Claire looked toward the dining room, where the turkey sat cooling beneath the chandelier, and the poinsettia occupied my husband's place at the table. No one mentioned dinner after that. Jacob and Claire left 20 minutes later, their coats buttoned, their faces tight with words they did not want to say in front of me. I stood in the doorway and watched their headlights pull away from the curb. Snow had started falling. Just a light dusting. Enough to soften the street. Not enough to cover anything. When I closed the door, the house seemed too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after guests leave. The kind that comes after funerals. The kind that makes every room feel like it is holding its breath. I walked back into the dining room. The candles had burned low. The gravy had formed a skin. The chair at the head of the table was still missing. I picked up the poinsettia and moved it to the sideboard. Then I dragged Thomas's chair back where it belonged. The sound of its wooden legs scraping against the floor echoed through the room. It was an ugly sound. A necessary one. I sat down in that chair for the first time since my husband died. Not because it felt right. Because something had been taken from me that night, and I needed to take one small thing back. That Christmas Eve I learned there had been a second will. What I did not know yet was far worse. Because the will was not the only thing that had been hidden from me. And before the week was over, I would discover just how long the deception had been going on. Long after Jacob and Claire left that night, I remained in the dining room. The Christmas tree lights blinked softly from the living room, casting faint reflections across the hardwood floor. The turkey sat untouched. The candles had nearly burned themselves out. Somewhere upstairs, the old grandfather clock marked each passing minute with steady determination. I didn't move. I couldn't. My son's confession kept replaying in my mind. A second will. Hidden for years. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Hidden. The distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. Outside, snow drifted quietly through the darkness. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Almost beautiful. Yet nothing felt peaceful inside me. I eventually gathered the dishes and carried them to the kitchen. The motions felt automatic, like muscle memory taking over when the mind becomes overwhelmed. I wrapped leftovers. I rinsed plates. I wiped counters that were already clean. Anything to avoid sitting still with my thoughts. But grief has a way of finding you anyway. By 11 o'clock, I found myself standing in Thomas's study. The room looked almost exactly as it had the day he died. His desk remained against the far wall beneath the window. His favorite leather chair sat slightly angled toward the bookshelf. A framed photograph of Jacob at his college graduation still occupied the corner of the desk. Dust had begun settling in places I rarely noticed. For months after his death, I had been unable to enter the room without crying. Then eventually I could enter without crying. Now I enter because I missed him. There is a difference. I sat in his chair and stared at the shelves. For 42 years, Thomas had been the person I trusted most. Not because he was perfect. He wasn't. He forgot anniversaries occasionally. He snored. He had a habit of leaving coffee cups in strange places. But he was honest. Painfully honest sometimes. Which made Jacob's confession feel even more impossible. If Thomas had created a second will, there had been a reason. And somehow everyone seemed to know that reason except me. I finally went to bed shortly after midnight. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob sitting across from me. I heard his voice. I found it years ago. Years. Not months. Not weeks. Years. At 6:30 the next morning, the coffee maker started its familiar sputtering sound. For decades, that sound had signaled the beginning of our day. Thomas would wander into the kitchen wearing slippers and an old blue robe, pretending he wasn't fully awake yet. He would kiss my forehead, complain about the weather, and ask whether we still had any blueberry jam left. The routine had been so ordinary, so reliable. Now the sound only reminded me of what wasn't there. I stood alone in the kitchen watching coffee drip into the pot. The second mug remained on the shelf. Thomas's mug. White ceramic. Small chip near the handle. I hadn't touched it since the funeral. A thin layer of dust had gathered along the rim. I stared at it longer than necessary. Then I looked away. The grief never completely leaves. It simply changes shape. After breakfast, I sorted through the mail stacked beside the refrigerator. Property tax notices. Utility bills. Insurance statements. Prescription receipts. The pile seemed thicker every month. Thomas had always managed most of these things. Not because I couldn't, because we divided responsibilities. He handled paperwork. I handled everything else. After he died, I discovered how expensive loneliness could be. I opened an electric bill. Then another envelope. Then another. Halfway through the stack, something caught my attention. An envelope addressed to Jacob. I frowned. The return address belonged to an accounting firm I vaguely recognized. A second envelope appeared farther down. Also addressed to Jacob. Different sender. Financial institution. My stomach tightened. I told myself it meant nothing. Maybe he was helping settle lingering estate matters. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Yet something about it bothered me. Thomas had been gone nearly 2 years. Why were important documents still finding their way to my son? And why had I never noticed before? The questions lingered all morning. By noon, I found myself wandering through the house instead of accomplishing anything useful. I dusted shelves, watered plants, folded blankets, unfolded them again. The truth was simple. I was waiting for Jacob to return with the copy of the will, waiting for answers, waiting for some explanation capable of transforming this entire situation into a misunderstanding. Deep down, I already knew that explanation wasn't coming. Around 1 o'clock, another memory surfaced. 3 months after Thomas's funeral, Jacob and Claire had replaced the home's security system. I remembered standing in the foyer while technicians carried equipment inside. Claire had explained everything with her usual efficiency. "We're just making sure you're protected." At the time, I appreciated the concern. When installation was complete, I asked for the new access code. Claire smiled. A perfectly pleasant smile. "Oh, don't worry about that. We'll handle it." I remembered laughing. Actually laughing. As though the response were completely reasonable. Now, sitting alone in my kitchen, the memory felt different. The code protected my home. Yet somehow I had become the only person who didn't know it. Small things. Always small things. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. That was what made them so easy to ignore. Around 2 o'clock, I opened an old photo album. The cover was worn from years of use. Inside were photographs spanning 4 decades. Vacations. Birthday parties, school events, Christmas mornings, family reunions, entire chapters of life preserved behind plastic sleeves. First, I simply turned pages. Then I began noticing something. In older photographs, I stood at the center. Not because I demanded attention, because I belonged there. I was the mother, the wife, the organizer, the person everyone gathered around. As years passed, something changed. Gradually, almost invisibly, I appeared farther from the center, standing off to one side, near the edge of group photos, behind other people, still present, yet somehow less included. The realization unsettled me. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe age was making me overly sensitive. Maybe, but maybe not. I closed the album. My phone rang shortly before 4. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Martin Green, Thomas's attorney. I hadn't spoken to him in months. For a moment, I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Then I answered. Martin. Eleanor. His voice sounded cautious, almost hesitant. That alone caught my attention. Martin wasn't a hesitant man. He had spent 30 years navigating legal disputes and complicated estate matters. Confidence practically lived inside his briefcase. How are you? He asked. I nearly laughed. How was I? My son had admitted hiding a second will on Christmas Eve. I hadn't slept, and every memory from the past 2 years suddenly felt suspect. I've been better. A brief silence followed. Then Martin said something that made my pulse quicken. Jacob told me he finally spoke with you. I sat up straighter. You knew. Another silence. Longer this time. Yes. The word landed heavily. How long have you known? I've known there were unresolved issues regarding Thomas's estate. That wasn't an answer. We both knew it. Martin. My voice remained calm. I need honesty right now. He exhaled slowly. I understand. The pause that followed felt endless. Finally, he spoke again. Eleanor, there's something regarding your husband's estate that I believe you should have seen a long time ago. Every muscle in my body tightened. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. What are you talking about? I'd rather discuss it in person. My grip tightened around the phone. No. Silence. No more partial answers. No more waiting. Not today. Martin remained quiet for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. More serious. More careful. Then let me say this. I waited. There are documents related to Thomas's final instructions that should have reached you. My heart began pounding. Should have. Yes. Did they? Another pause. No. I stared through the kitchen window. Snow still covered the backyard. Birds hopped across the fence searching for food. The world looked completely normal, which somehow made everything worse. What kind of documents? I think that's a conversation we need to have face to face. The frustration rising inside me surprised even me. For most of my life, patience had been one of my strengths. Not today. Not anymore. When? I asked. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. Yes. I closed my eyes. A second will. Missing documents. Unanswered questions. And now Thomas's attorney was telling me there was more. Much more. We arranged to meet the following afternoon. A small coffee shop downtown. The same one Thomas used to visit after client meetings. After ending the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table. The room felt strangely still. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked somewhere down the hallway. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary house. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Jacob's confession had already shaken my understanding of the last 2 years. Now Martin's call suggested something worse. Something larger. Perhaps the second will wasn't the secret. Perhaps it was only the doorway leading to it. As evening settled outside my windows, one thought refused to leave me. If a second will could remain hidden for years, what else had been hidden with it? And for the first time since Thomas died, I found myself wondering whether the loneliness I had blamed on grief had actually begun somewhere else. Somewhere much closer to home. I met Martin the following afternoon. The coffee shop sat on the corner of Maple and 7th, exactly where it had been for as long as I could remember. Thomas used to bring clients there after meetings. He claimed people were more honest over coffee than they were in conference rooms. At the time, I thought it was one of his harmless theories. Now I wasn't so sure. Snow clung to the sidewalks in gray patches as I parked across the street. The December sky hung low over the town, heavy and colorless. Inside, the cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon pastries, and wet winter coats. Nothing had changed. The brass light fixtures were the same. The worn wooden booths were the same. Even the old chalkboard menu looked familiar. Yet everything felt different. Perhaps because I was different. Martin was already there when I arrived. He sat in a corner booth near the back, a leather folder resting beside his coffee cup. His silver hair looked thinner than I remembered, and deep lines had formed around his eyes. For the first time in years, he looked tired. When he saw me approaching, he stood. Eleanor. Martin. We exchanged a brief hug before sitting. Neither of us touched the menus. Neither of us needed more coffee. We both knew why I was there. For several moments, nobody spoke. The sounds of the cafe filled the silence. A milk steamer hissed behind the counter. Someone laughed near the front door. A spoon clinked against ceramic. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind that feels strangely distant when your world has begun shifting beneath your feet. Finally, Martin slid the leather folder toward me. I wasn't sure whether to bring this. I looked down at it. What is it? Context. The word settled heavily between us. I placed my hand on the folder but didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I looked at him. You knew about the second will. It wasn't a question. Martin nodded slowly. Yes. How long? Since shortly after Thomas passed away. The answer hurt more than I expected. Not because Martin had known. Because so many people had known. Everyone except me. I stared through the cafe window for a moment before returning my attention to him. Why didn't anyone tell me? His expression tightened. Eleanor, the situation became complicated. I almost laughed. Complicated. Another harmless word. Another word people seem to use when they don't want to say what they really mean. My husband wrote a second will. I kept my voice calm. My son hid it. Martin looked down. I know. And now you're telling me there are documents I should have seen. Yes. That doesn't sound complicated. No response. Only silence. The kind that often tells the truth before words do. After several moments, Martin spoke again. When Thomas updated certain estate documents during the final year of his illness, he left very specific instructions. I frowned. Instructions. Martin nodded. Instructions regarding transparency. The word immediately caught my attention. Transparency. Not inheritance. Not money. Not property. Transparency. What kind of transparency? Instead of answering directly, Martin opened the folder. He removed several papers and placed them on the table. Between us. My stomach tightened immediately. Letters. Official correspondence. Estate notices. Meeting summaries. Ordinary documents. Except for one detail. Every single one was addressed to me. I picked up the first letter. My name appeared clearly across the top. Eleanor Parker. My address. My mailbox. My house. Yet I had never seen it before. I checked the date. 18 months earlier. A chill moved through me. What is this? A letter regarding a review of Thomas's estate structure. I stared at him. I never received it. I know. I picked up another. Then another. Different dates. Different senders. Different purposes. The same result. I had never seen any of them. My hands began trembling slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. I looked at the envelopes again. My name. My address. My life. Documents intended for me. Documents that somehow never reached me. How many are there? Martin hesitated. More than I'd like. I sat back slowly. Part of me wanted an explanation. Another part was afraid of one. Maybe the mail was lost. The words sounded weak even to me. Martin remained silent. I continued anyway. Maybe there was some mistake. Still silence. I looked down at the stack again. One missing letter could be a mistake. Two might be bad luck. Several years' worth felt different. Much different. How many mistakes begin to look like a pattern before they stop being mistakes? The question lingered in my mind. Martin carefully folded his hands. Eleanor, I need to be very careful about assumptions. I nodded. So do I. Another silence settled between us. Then he reached into the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. This may help explain some things. I glanced down. The heading immediately caught my attention. Estate review meeting. The date. 6 months after Thomas's funeral. A strange sensation moved through me. Something between confusion and dread. I continued reading. Attendees Martin Green. Financial advisor. Jacob Parker. Claire Parker. I scanned the list again. Then a third time. My name wasn't there. Not anywhere. For several seconds I simply stared at the page. I felt foolish doing it. As though looking longer might somehow cause my name to appear. It didn't. I wasn't there. Martin's voice softened. No. I swallowed. I wasn't invited. No. The answer landed harder. The waitress appeared beside the table. Neither of us noticed her until she spoke. Would either of you like a refill? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My entire understanding of the past 2 years was unraveling. And someone wanted to know whether I needed more coffee. No thank you. She smiled and moved away. The normal world continued spinning. Mine did not. I looked back at the document. Questions crowded my mind. Why were they meeting without me? Martin hesitated. The hesitation bothered me more than any answer could have. Because it suggested he already knew where this conversation might lead. I believe they felt they were helping. Helping. There was that word again. Helping. Protecting. Managing. Simplifying. Words that always sounded generous. Words that increasingly felt like locked doors. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 6 months after Thomas died, I had asked Jacob about an accountant's meeting. I remembered standing in my kitchen holding a utility bill. Should I be there? Jacob had smiled. A quick reassuring smile. No need, Mom. Everything's already been handled. At the time I found the answer comforting. Sitting across from Martin now, it felt very different. How many things had already been handled without me? I stared down at the meeting summary again. Another detail caught my eye. Claire's name appeared repeatedly throughout the notes. Questions from Claire. Recommendations from Claire. Concerns raised by Claire. I frowned. Claire attended multiple meetings? Martin nodded. Several. I looked up slowly. I attended none. The silence that followed was painful. Not because anyone argued. Because nobody could. The facts sat there between us. Cold. Simple. Undeniable. A daughter-in-law had participated in discussions about my future. The wife of the deceased man had not. I suddenly remembered something Thomas used to say. Pay attention when someone starts answering questions nobody asked them. At the time I thought he meant business. Now I wondered whether he meant something else entirely. Martin shifted in his seat. Your husband worried about one thing near the end. I looked up. What? He worried that you trusted people too easily. The words surprised me. Not because they sounded harsh. Because they sounded familiar. Thomas had said something similar many times. Usually with a smile. Usually after I gave someone another chance. Or accepted an explanation that didn't quite make sense. I used to consider it one of his affectionate complaints. Now it sounded different. More serious. More important. Perhaps because he wasn't here to explain it. Martin reached back into the folder. This next document matters. My pulse quickened. He placed a single page in front of me. An acknowledgement form. Official. Signed. Dated. Jacob's signature appeared near the bottom. I stared at it. Then read the heading. Receipt of estate correspondence. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Jacob had acknowledged receiving estate documents. Officially. In writing. Not accidentally. Not by rumor. Not through misunderstanding. He knew. The realization settled heavily inside me. I wanted to feel anger. Instead I felt tired. Deeply tired. Because every answer seemed to create 3 more questions. Because every explanation revealed another missing piece. Because nothing about this situation felt simple anymore. The cafe around us continued buzzing with life. People ordered lunch. Friends exchanged stories. Someone celebrated a birthday near the front window. Meanwhile, I sat across from my husband's attorney, discovering that entire conversations about my future had taken place without me. A strange numbness settled over me. I looked down at Jacob's signature again. My son. The boy I raised. The man I trusted. The person who should have been sitting beside me. Not across from me. Not hidden behind paperwork. Beside me. Where family belongs. Martin cleared his throat softly. There is one more document. I looked up. What kind of document? For the first time that afternoon, he appeared uncomfortable. Genuinely uncomfortable. He removed a sealed envelope from the folder. Cream-colored. Slightly worn. My name appeared on the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. Thomas's handwriting. My breath caught. Even after 2 years, I knew every curve of those letters. Every stroke. Every detail. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards. Anniversary notes. Grocery lists. Love letters. 42 years of marriage leaves marks on your memory. This was left with instructions. My eyes never left the envelope. What instructions? Martin's voice lowered. Thomas asked me to give it to you only if certain circumstances occurred. The room suddenly felt smaller. The sounds of the cafe faded. Everything narrowed to that envelope. Those familiar letters. My name. His handwriting. What circumstances? Martin looked directly at me. If someone in your family chose secrecy over honesty. For several seconds I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't think. The envelope rested quietly on the table between us. Simple. Ordinary. Yet somehow it felt heavier than everything else in the folder combined. Because for the first time since Christmas Eve, a terrifying possibility entered my mind. Thomas hadn't merely prepared for his death. He had prepared for something that might happen afterward. And as I stared at the sealed envelope resting between us, I realized something that frightened me more than the second will itself. My husband may have seen the betrayal coming long before I did. I carried the envelope home without opening it. It rested on the passenger seat the entire drive, illuminated occasionally by pale winter sunlight filtering through the windshield. Several times I glanced at it while stopped at traffic lights. Each time my stomach tightened. Not because I feared what Thomas had written, because I feared why he had written it. The envelope seemed impossibly small for something that suddenly felt capable of changing everything. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sky had darkened into shades of gray. Snow remained piled along the edges of the yard, untouched except for a few animal tracks crossing toward the woods behind the house. The house stood exactly where it always had. The same white siding. The same front porch. The same brass mailbox Thomas insisted on polishing every spring. Yet somehow it felt different. As though I had returned to a place I knew while carrying knowledge that no longer allowed me to see it the same way. I left the envelope unopened. Not out of fear. At least that was what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. I wasn't ready. For 2 years, I had believed I understood my husband's death. Not accepted it. No one ever truly accepts that kind of loss. But I believed I understood it. Now I wasn't sure I understood anything. Inside, I hung my coat and stood quietly in the foyer. The house greeted me with familiar silence. Not empty silence. Lived-in silence. The kind created by decades of routine. The kind that lingers after someone is gone. My eyes drifted toward the hallway. Photographs lined the walls. Dozens of them. 42 years reduced to frames and glass. I began walking slowly. The first photograph showed Thomas and me standing outside our first apartment. I was 23. He was 26. We looked impossibly young. The apartment had been tiny. The plumbing was unreliable. The carpet was orange. And we thought we were rich because we owned our own coffee table. I smiled despite myself. Further down the hallway stood a picture from Jacob's first day of kindergarten. Then another from a camping trip in Colorado. Then Christmas mornings. Birthdays. Graduations. Anniversaries. Entire decades compressed into snapshots. As I studied them, one realization settled heavily over me. Almost every important memory in my life involved Thomas. Not because he dominated the story, because we built the story together. The envelope remained tucked beneath my arm, waiting, patient, like the past itself. I eventually made my way into the living room and sat beside the fireplace. The reading glasses were still on the bookshelf. Thomas's glasses. I picked them up carefully. The lenses reflected the fading afternoon light. For a moment, I could almost see him sitting across from me, reading the newspaper, pretending not to fall asleep, arguing with editorials, laughing at comics. The ordinary things become sacred after someone dies. Nobody tells you that beforehand. You discover it yourself. One memory surfaced unexpectedly. The day we met. I had been 23 years old and working at a local bank. Thomas came in wearing a navy suit that didn't fit quite right. He wasn't the most handsome man in the room. Not the wealthiest. Not the loudest. But he listened. Really listened. That was rare. Even then. When I spoke, he paid attention. When others interrupted, he waited. When I mentioned a book I loved, he remembered the title 6 weeks later. I remember calling my sister afterward. I think I met someone unusual. She laughed. Good unusual or bad unusual? Good. And he was. For 42 years he was. Not perfect. Never perfect. But good. The memory warmed me for a moment before grief settled over it again. Because the better the marriage had been, the harder it became to understand why there had been secrets at the end. I carried the envelope into the kitchen. Still unopened. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. Outside, daylight faded. The house slowly filled with evening shadows. I made tea. Not because I wanted tea. Because I needed something to do with my hands. For years, Thomas and I had ended our evenings at that kitchen table. Tea for me. Coffee for him. Even after doctors told him to stop drinking it. Some habits survive common sense. As steam rose from the mug, another memory surfaced. The final year of his illness. The hardest year of our marriage. Not because we loved each other less. Because we loved each other enough to keep pretending everything would be fine. I learned many kinds of exhaustion during that year. Physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. Financial exhaustion. And the exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love slowly disappear one piece at a time. Pill bottles lined the bathroom counter. Appointment cards covered the refrigerator. Insurance paperwork filled drawers. There were weeks when I spent more time in hospitals than in my own home. Weeks when every phone call made my heart race. Weeks when I forgot what normal felt like. Yet if someone had offered me another year of that struggle, I would have accepted without hesitation. Because it would have meant another year with him. Toward the end, Thomas became quieter. Not withdrawn. Reflective. As though he was taking inventory of a life he knew was nearing its conclusion. One evening while sitting together on the porch, he looked out toward the trees and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. If anything happens to me, you'll be all right. I laughed. That's not a plan. He smiled. That familiar patient smile. I've made plans. I remember rolling my eyes. You always make plans. Someone has to. At the time it felt like an ordinary conversation. Now those words echoed differently. I've made plans. The envelope sitting beside my tea suddenly felt heavier. I closed my eyes. Another memory arrived. The funeral. The flowers. The condolences. The endless casseroles. The exhaustion. I remembered standing beside the cemetery after most people had left. Jacob stood on one side of me. Claire stood on the other. Both of them looked concerned. Protective. Loving. At least that's what I believed. A few weeks later, I asked whether Thomas had left any special instructions. Anything personal. Anything he wanted me to know. Jacob squeezed my shoulder. Don't worry about any of that right now, Mom. Claire nodded, smiling gently. At the time I thought they were protecting me. Now I wondered whether they were protecting something else. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because it proved wrongdoing. Because it forced me to question memories I once considered comforting. Eventually, the house grew dark enough that I turned on the kitchen light. The yellow glow spread across the table, across the tea mug, across the envelope. I stared at it for several minutes, then finally reached for it. My hands trembled slightly, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. The seal opened easily. Inside was a folded letter. Several pages. Thomas's handwriting covered the first sheet. Seeing it nearly undid me. For 2 years I had searched for traces of him everywhere. Voicemails, old notes, birthday cards, receipts with hurried messages scribbled in the margins. Now here he was again, speaking directly to me. Across time, across grief, across death. I unfolded the first page carefully. The room seemed impossibly quiet. Even the clock felt distant. I lowered my eyes to the paper and began reading. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something has happened exactly as I feared. My breath caught. I stopped. Read the sentence again. Then a third time. Something has happened exactly as I feared. Not hoped. Not expected. Feared. The distinction mattered. A cold sensation moved through me. Because for the first time since Thomas died, I realized a possibility I had been unwilling to consider. Perhaps the second will wasn't the beginning of the story. Perhaps it was only evidence that the story had already begun. I looked down at the page again. The handwriting remained steady, confident, familiar. Thomas had written these words knowing there was a chance I would one day need them, knowing there was a chance something might go wrong, knowing there was a chance the people we trusted most might make choices he couldn't prevent. Outside, wind brushed softly against the windows. Inside, the kitchen felt suspended between past and present, between certainty and doubt, between the marriage I remembered and the truth I was only beginning to uncover. I read that first sentence one final time, slowly, carefully, because for the first time since my husband's death, I realized he may have seen the betrayal coming long before I did. I sat there for a long time before reading the next line. Outside, bare branches scraped softly against the kitchen window. The wind had picked up since sunset, carrying loose snow across the backyard in thin white ribbons. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The clock above the stove continued ticking, steady, patient, unconcerned, as if the world had not just shifted beneath my feet. The kitchen light cast a warm circle across the table, illuminating Thomas's letter, my untouched tea, and the reading glasses resting beside the envelope. The glasses made it worse somehow. They made him feel close. Close enough that I could almost hear his voice. Close enough that I forgot he was gone. For a few precious seconds. Then reality returned, and I lowered my eyes to the page. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then something has happened exactly as I feared. Before anything else, I need you to know this. None of what follows is your fault. Your kindness has always been one of the things I loved most about you. I stopped reading. A lump formed in my throat, not because the words were dramatic, because they sounded exactly like him. Thomas had always begun difficult conversations with reassurance, not because he avoided truth, because he believed people deserved compassion before criticism. I remembered countless moments throughout our marriage. Arguments, bad news, medical diagnoses, financial worries. He always began the same way, with kindness. Even now, even from beyond the grave. My fingers tightened around the edge of the letter. I continued reading. During my illness, I began noticing certain things. Conversations that ended when I entered a room. Decisions discussed without including you. Questions answered before you had the chance to ask them yourself. Documents moved from one place to another without explanation. I froze. Every sentence felt familiar. Not because I remembered those exact moments, because I remembered the feeling that things were happening around me rather than with me. At the time I dismissed it. Thomas was sick. Everyone was stressed. Jacob was overwhelmed. Claire was trying to help. Those explanations seemed reasonable. Now they seemed incomplete. I read the paragraph again. Then again. The words hadn't changed. Only my understanding of them had. The hardest part was not what people said. It was what they stopped saying. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It fades quietly, one omission at a time. I closed my eyes. The sentence struck somewhere deep inside me, because it explained something I hadn't been able to articulate for years. I had spent so much time questioning my own feelings, wondering whether I was becoming too sensitive, too emotional, too lonely. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe everyone really was just busy. Maybe families naturally drift apart. Yet deep down there had always been another feeling. A quieter one. The feeling that I was slowly being moved farther from the center of my own. Family. Not pushed. Not rejected. Simply repositioned. Until one day I looked around and realized I was standing at the edge. The realization hurt more than anger ever could. Because nobody had announced it. Nobody had asked for permission. It had happened gradually. So gradually that I barely noticed. Until now. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 2 years before Thomas died. A Sunday lunch at our house. Jacob and Claire had come over after church. We were sitting around this very table. Claire was discussing future home renovations. At the time I barely paid attention. But now I remembered something strange. She had spoken about the house as if she already had some responsibility for it. As if decisions regarding its future naturally belonged to her. I remembered laughing. Thomas hadn't. At the time I thought he was simply tired. Now I wasn't sure. I looked back down at the letter. I may be wrong. In fact, I hope I am. But I worry that some people see our family as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. No names. No accusations. No dramatic declarations. Just concern. Quiet concern. The kind Thomas always expressed when something troubled him. My stomach tightened. I knew exactly who my mind wanted to blame. But the letter wasn't blaming anyone. Not yet. Thomas was doing what he always did. Observing. Recording. Waiting. That somehow made the words more powerful. Not less. Because Thomas had never been a man prone to paranoia. If something worried him enough to write it down, there was usually a reason. I continued reading. If events unfold in a way that concerns you, look at patterns rather than promises. Patterns reveal character.
Promise révèle intention.
The two are not always the same. Patterns. The word echoed inside my head. Patterns. Suddenly I remembered Martin saying nearly the same thing years ago after a difficult business dispute. Then I remembered Thomas saying it dozens of times throughout our marriage. Pay attention to patterns. Not promises. Patterns. I stared at the letter. Then slowly looked around my kitchen. Memories began resurfacing. One after another. Like puzzle pieces suddenly finding their place. Claire speaking for Jacob. Claire answering questions directed at me.
Claire handling gedulees.
Claire coordinating meetings. Claire deciding who needed to know what. Always reasonable. Always polite. Always helpful. Until viewed together. Then something else emerged. A pattern. The realization made me uneasy. Not because it proved wrongdoing. Because it suggested intention. I folded the first page aside. A second sheet slipped partially free from the envelope. Something else had been tucked behind the letter. I pulled it out carefully. Not another letter. A list. Several pages. Handwritten notes. Dates. Meetings. Observations. Thomas's handwriting covered every inch of the paper. I leaned closer. The first page contained nothing remarkable. Medical appointments. Financial reviews. Estate consultations. Then one line caught my attention. Claire requested access to estate records. I stared at it. The date was nearly a year before Thomas died. Full year. Not after his death. Before. My pulse quickened. I continued reading. Several months later. Discuss future communication structure. Then. Review recommended before implementation. Then. Need to ensure Eleanor remains fully informed. That last sentence stopped me cold. Need to ensure Eleanor remains fully informed. I read it 3 times. Because it contradicted everything that had happened afterward. If Thomas wanted me fully informed, how had I ended up excluded from so much? The question lingered. Unanswered. Uncomfortable. I wanted certainty. Instead I found more complexity. My phone rang. The sudden sound made me jump. Martin. I answered immediately. Martin. Did you read it? I looked down at the pages spread across the table. Yes. Silence. Then. What do you think? I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the question felt impossible. I think I have more questions than answers. That's normal. Normal. There was that word again. Nothing about this felt normal. Martin, I said quietly. Did Thomas actually believe something was wrong? A pause. Then. He believed something could go wrong. The distinction mattered. Thomas wasn't predicting betrayal. He was preparing for possibility. That sounded exactly like him. What else haven't I seen? The line went quiet, long enough to make my stomach tighten. Finally Martin spoke. There are additional records. What kind of records? Meeting notes. Correspondence. Requests. The word requests caught my attention. Requests from who? Silence. Then, various people. I knew he was being careful. Legally careful. Professionally careful. It was still frustrating. Before I could press further, he added something unexpected. Eleanor, your husband expected you to participate in every major estate discussion. I felt my chest tighten. Every major estate discussion. The phrase echoed inside my mind. Because I hadn't participated in any. Not one. I remembered sitting alone after the funeral, writing thank you notes, paying bills, trying to remember how to live without Thomas. Meanwhile, meetings had taken place. Documents had circulated. Conversations had happened. And nobody had invited me. I closed my eyes. For a moment I couldn't speak. When I finally did, my voice sounded distant. I was his wife. Yes. I should have been there. Yes. The simple agreement hurt more than argument would have, because it confirmed what I already knew. I had not imagined the exclusion. It had happened. Quietly. Consistently. Repeatedly. Martin remained silent for a moment. Then he said something that immediately captured my attention. There's one meeting in particular you need to see. I opened my eyes. What meeting? The one that took place 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral. My breath caught. 3 weeks. The exact same time frame Jacob had mentioned when he discovered the second will. The same period when grief had swallowed entire days of my life. The same period when I could barely remember to eat. What happened in that meeting? Silence. Then, that's a conversation for tomorrow. I almost protested, but stopped myself, because suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted the answer tonight. Not after everything else. Not after the letter. Not after the notes. Not after discovering how much had been happening around me while I was busy surviving my husband's death. We ended the call shortly afterward. The house fell silent again. Looked down at the pages spread across the table. Thomas's handwriting. Thomas's concerns. Thomas's attempt to protect me. And somewhere inside all of it, a truth I still couldn't fully see. I carefully stacked the papers together, then rested my hand on top of them. 3 weeks after I buried my husband, decisions about my future had already been discussed, perhaps even made, and nobody had invited me into the room. That realization stayed with me long after midnight, because for the first time I wasn't just grieving what I had lost. I was grieving what had been taken without my knowledge, and I had a feeling tomorrow's meeting with Martin would reveal just how much that really was. I arrived at Martin's office the following afternoon carrying more questions than I could count. The building sat 3 blocks from the courthouse, a red brick structure that had housed law offices for decades. Thomas and I had walked through those doors countless times over the years. Estate planning, tax reviews, business matters, the ordinary responsibilities of adulthood. Never once had I imagined I would someday walk in alone, trying to understand why decisions about my life had been made without me. The receptionist greeted me by name. That small kindness nearly undid me. So much of the past week had been filled with revelations that made me feel invisible. Being recognized felt strangely comforting. Martin met me in the lobby. His expression told me he hadn't slept much either. Thank you for coming. I nodded. I'm not sure I had much choice. A faint smile crossed his face. No. I suppose you didn't. He led me into a conference room overlooking a small parking lot dusted with snow. The room itself was unremarkable. A polished wooden table. Leather chairs. Shelves lined with legal books. Nothing dramatic. Nothing threatening. Yet my pulse quickened as soon as I saw the folder waiting at my seat. The same folder from the coffee shop. Only thicker. Much thicker. Martin noticed where I was looking. That's the meeting file. I swallowed. The one after Thomas's funeral? Yes. The room suddenly felt smaller. I took my seat slowly. Martin sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he pushed the folder toward me. Take your time. I opened it. The paper looked ordinary. Thin. Unremarkable. Yet my hands felt strangely heavy as I turned the first page. Because somewhere inside those documents existed a version of my life I had never been allowed to see. The heading appeared immediately. Estate planning follow-up meeting below it. Date: 3 weeks after funeral services. I stared at the words. 3 weeks. 3 weeks after I buried my husband. 3 weeks after I stood at his grave unable to imagine a future without him. 3 weeks after I was still waking up expecting him beside me. I continued reading. Then I saw the attendee list. Martin Green, financial advisor Jacob Parker, Claire Parker. My eyes moved across the page again. Then again. Then a third time. Looking for something impossible. My name. It wasn't there. Not anywhere. The absence felt louder than any accusation.
He sat motionless.
The paper trembling slightly in my hands. I wasn't invited. The words emerged quietly. Martin nodded. No. I looked back down. The humiliation surprised me. Not because I expected an invitation. Because I hadn't known there was a meeting at all. The realization made me feel foolish. Like the only person who hadn't been informed about something involving my own future. I forced myself to continue reading. The first several paragraphs were routine. Asset reviews. Tax considerations. Administrative updates. Nothing shocking. Then a heading stopped me. Discussion regarding future housing arrangements for Eleanor Parker. My stomach tightened. Housing arrangements. 2 simple words. Yet somehow they made me feel less like a person and more like a project. I read the heading again. Housing arrangements. Not Eleanor's wishes. Not Eleanor's preferences. Not Eleanor's decisions. Housing arrangements. As if my future were a logistical problem waiting to be solved. Martin remained silent, allowing me to process the document at my own pace. I appreciated that. The truth rarely needs help being painful. I continued. A note appeared beneath the heading. Claire suggested exploring alternatives that would be easier for Eleanor to manage. Easier. There was that word again. Helpful. Practical. Protective. Easier. Words that sounded compassionate until you looked closely. Easier for who? I asked quietly. Martin didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, I suspect that's part of what we're trying to understand. I nodded slowly, because the question wasn't really about houses. It was about authority. Who had been deciding what was best for me? And why? A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A conversation in my kitchen shortly after the funeral. Claire standing beside the refrigerator, holding a cup of tea, speaking casually. Have you ever thought about downsizing? At the time I assumed she was making conversation. Now I wondered if she had already attended this meeting. The thought sent a chill through me. I continued reading. The next section detailed various possibilities. Condominium options. Retirement communities. Maintenance concerns. Property management. The language remained polite. Professional. Reasonable. Yet nowhere did I find one important thing. My opinion. Nobody had recorded it. Because nobody had asked. I turned another page. Then froze. A sentence near the bottom caught my attention. No objections recorded. I stared at those 3 words. Again. And again. Then looked at Martin. What does this refer to? He adjusted his glasses. Several recommendations were discussed. Several recommendations. No objections recorded. I understood immediately. Claire had spoken. The advisors had spoken. Suggestions had been made. Ideas had been discussed. And Jacob had remained silent. The realization hurt more than anything Claire had said. Because silence can be a decision too. I looked down again. Suddenly every blank space on the page seemed louder than the text itself. No objections recorded. My son had been there. My son had listened. My son had said nothing. The disappointment settled heavily inside me. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just heavy. Like a stone placed carefully inside my chest. I kept reading. Another heading appeared. Estate distribution timeline review. A note beneath it read. Correspondence regarding revised estate distribution schedule. Revised. Another harmless word. Another word I had never agreed to. I looked up. What was revised? Martin folded his hands. The timeline regarding certain estate disclosures. My stomach tightened further. Disclosures to who? His expression shifted. Subtle, but noticeable. To you. The room went silent. I stared at him, then back at the document, then back at him. Meaning information intended for me was delayed? Martin chose his next words carefully. Information intended for you did not always reach you when Thomas intended it to. Not always. The understatement would have been almost funny under different circumstances. I leaned back slowly. For weeks I had been asking what happened. Now I was beginning to see how it happened. Not through one enormous betrayal. Through dozens of smaller decisions. Small enough to justify. Small enough to explain away. Small enough to ignore. Until they weren't. Martin reached toward the folder. There is something else. I looked up. He turned several pages. Then pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. I read it. Once. Then twice. Then a third time. Thomas Parker insisted that no major decisions affecting Eleanor Parker be finalized without her direct participation and informed consent. I stopped breathing for a moment. There it was. Clear. Direct. Unmistakable. Thomas had anticipated this exact problem. He had written protections into the process. He had tried. For several seconds I couldn't speak. My eyes blurred. Not from tears. From exhaustion. Because suddenly betrayal stopped feeling abstract. It had dates. Names. Signatures. Meeting notes. Evidence. I wasn't imagining anything. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't rewriting history. The proof sat in front of me, printed on paper. I looked at Martin. Then why was I excluded? The question emerged barely above a whisper. He held my gaze. I don't think that's a question I can answer. I knew what he meant. Only Jacob could answer it. And perhaps Claire. The realization settled between us. Heavy and unavoidable. After another hour reviewing documents, I finally closed the folder. My head ached. My shoulders felt tight. My entire life seemed divided into two versions. The version I remembered, and the version hidden inside these pages. Neither matched perfectly anymore. When I left Martin's office, daylight was already fading. The parking lot glittered beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to gather myself, trying to breathe, trying to understand. By the time I reached home, darkness had settled across the neighborhood. I carried the folder inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and stood staring at it. The dishwasher still held breakfast dishes. The mail remained unopened on the counter. A prescription refill reminder blinked on my phone. Ordinary things. Normal things. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. I opened the folder one final time before bed. One page remained near the back. A page I had somehow overlooked earlier. A handwritten note. Short. Informal. Almost careless. Yet the words sent a chill through me. Claire believes Eleanor will eventually agree. I stared at the sentence. Agree to what? Nobody had asked me. Nobody had told me. Nobody had included me. Yet somehow there was confidence that I would eventually agree. The assumption felt deeply unsettling. Not because of what it said. Because of what it revealed. Someone had been planning outcomes before conversations ever happened. My eyes drifted toward the window. Snow continued falling outside. Quiet. Steady. Relentless. Just before leaving Martin's office, he had stopped me at the door. The memory returned now. Clear as day. Eleanor. I had turned. Yes. His expression had grown serious. There is something else. My stomach had tightened immediately. What now? He hesitated. The hesitation alone told me I wasn't going to like the answer. That wasn't the only meeting. I remember staring at him, trying to process the words. How many meetings were there? A long pause. Then, more than one. Now, standing alone in my kitchen, I felt that answer settling into place. If they had discussed my future once without me, how many other conversations had happened behind closed doors? And more importantly, what else had they decided before I ever knew there was a decision to make? That night I couldn't sleep. The house creaked softly around me as winter settled deeper into the walls. Pipes expanded and contracted. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, A dog barked once and then fell silent. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking, not about the second will, not about Martin's office, not even about the meetings. I kept thinking about patterns. Thomas's word. Patterns. For most of my life I had trusted people based on what they said. Thomas trusted people based on what they consistently did. Maybe that was why he had seen trouble coming before I did. Around midnight I gave up on sleep. I slipped out of bed, wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and made my way downstairs. The house felt different at night. Larger. Quieter. More honest somehow. There was no television. No phone calls. No distractions. Just memories. I found myself standing in front of the bookshelf in the living room. Without really thinking about it, I reached for one of the old family photo albums. The cover was worn and faded. The binding had been repaired twice. Thomas used to joke that we needed a separate room just for photographs. Maybe he was right. I carried the album to the coffee table and opened it. The first pages showed our early years. Camping trips. Picnics. Birthday cakes made from box mix because we couldn't afford much else. There was Jacob at 5 years old, grinning with missing front teeth. There was Thomas teaching him how to ride a bicycle. There was me holding a birthday cake while both of them laughed at something outside the frame. For a while I simply looked, smiled, remembered. Then something changed. As I moved through the years, a pattern began emerging. At first it was subtle, almost invisible. The kind of thing you would never notice if you weren't specifically looking for it. In older photographs I stood in the center. Not because I demanded attention. Because I belonged there. I was the mother. The organizer. The one gathering everyone together. But gradually over time something shifted. I appeared farther toward the edge. Still present. Still smiling. Still invited. Yet somehow less central. Less included. A strange sadness settled over me. Not because of the photographs themselves. Because they reflected something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The distance hadn't appeared overnight. It had happened slowly. Year by year. Memory by memory. One Christmas came back to me. Then another. Then another. One year Jacob and Claire arrived 2 hours late. The next year they left early because they had another commitment. The year after that, they spent part of Christmas Day with Claire's family. Perfectly reasonable. Every explanation had sounded reasonable. That was the problem. Each individual moment made sense. Only together did they tell a story. I turned another page. A birthday dinner. Then another. Then another. I remembered waiting for phone calls. Rescheduling celebrations. Changing plans because people were busy. Life happens, I always told myself. People grow up. Families evolve. All true. But not entirely true. Not anymore. I closed the album and sat back. The room suddenly felt colder. My eyes drifted toward the Christmas tree still standing near the window. Its lights reflected softly in the dark glass. The season that once felt comforting now seemed filled with questions. Questions I should have asked years ago. The next morning I woke exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I spent most of the day sorting through the electronic files Martin had emailed me. The process was tedious. Pages of correspondence. Meeting notes. Financial summaries. Estate reviews. Most of it looked harmless. Boring even. The kind of paperwork nobody remembers once it's finished. Yet one thing kept appearing. Claire's name. Again. And again. And again. Not dramatically. Not suspiciously. Just consistently. Questions from Claire. Recommendations from Claire. Clarifications from Claire. Requests from Claire. The repetition began bothering me. Not because she participated. Because she participated so often. At one point I found myself opening a spreadsheet and keeping track. The results unsettled me. In document after document Claire appeared. I rarely did. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One email stopped me completely. It was short. Professional. Ordinary. The kind of message most people would read and immediately forget. Let's keep this simple for Eleanor. That was all. One sentence. Nothing offensive. Nothing cruel. Yet I stared at it for nearly a minute. Simple. Another harmless word. Another word that seemed to appear whenever someone was making decisions on my behalf. Simple, protective, practical, manageable. Every word pointed in the same direction. Less information, less involvement, less participation. The realization made me deeply uncomfortable, because none of it sounded malicious. It sounded paternal, as if everyone had quietly agreed I needed managing. The thought lingered long after I closed the email. Around lunchtime, I found myself thinking about Jacob, not the man sitting in estate meetings, the boy I raised, the teenager who hated confrontation, the young man who apologized when other people bumped into him. Jacob had never enjoyed conflict, even as a child. If two friends argued, he became uncomfortable. If teachers disagreed, he became anxious. If difficult conversations appeared, he avoided them whenever possible. That realization softened some of my anger. Not all of it, but some, because suddenly I could imagine how this happened. Not through cruelty, through avoidance. One uncomfortable conversation delayed, then another, until years passed, and the truth became too large to face. The possibility didn't excuse anything, but it explained something. And explanations matter. I continued reading. Another email appeared. This one older, several years old, sent long before Thomas died. The date immediately caught my attention. I read carefully. I think it's better if we handle the estate discussions ourselves for now. She's under enough stress. Claire. Again. I leaned back slowly. For years I believed they were protecting me. Now I wondered whether they had been protecting access. The thought made me feel guilty, almost disloyal. Claire had brought meals during Thomas's treatments. She had visited the hospital. She had sat beside me at the funeral. Those things happened. They were real. And yet, people are complicated. Good actions do not erase harmful ones. Neither do harmful actions erase every good thing a person has done. Life rarely divides itself into heroes and villains. The realization made everything harder, not easier. Late that afternoon, another document arrived from Martin. More correspondence. More emails. More records. I almost ignored it. Then one sentence caught my eye. A single line buried inside a chain of messages. No need to involve Eleanor yet. I stared at the screen. Yet. Such a small word. For letters. One syllable. Yet. Sometimes yet means later. Sometimes it means eventually. And sometimes yet quietly becomes never. The sentence followed me for hours. Through dinner. Through washing dishes. Through another restless evening. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized how often later had become never. Later became missed meetings. Later became hidden documents. Later became years. That evening, I pulled one of Thomas's old notebooks from the bookshelf. Most pages contained ordinary things. Business ideas. Shopping lists. Reminders. Then I found a sentence underlined twice. People reveal themselves slowly. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. I smiled sadly. There it was again. Patterns, not promises. I remembered hearing him say it countless times. At the time, I assumed he was talking about business. Maybe he was talking about life. Maybe he was talking about family. Maybe he was trying to teach me something I wasn't ready to learn. Near midnight, I opened one final folder. One final email chain. I almost skipped it. Then the date caught my attention. 3 weeks before Thomas died. My stomach tightened immediately. The sender was Claire. The recipient was Jacob. The subject line appeared ordinary. Nothing remarkable. I opened it anyway. The message was brief. We need to discuss the future before things become complicated. That was all. No explanation. No details. No context. Just one sentence. Yet it hit me harder than anything else I had read. 3 weeks before my husband died. Before the funeral. Before the second will disappeared. Before the meetings. Before the grief swallowed everything. They were already discussing the future. A future I wasn't part of. A future being planned while I spent my days managing medications, speaking with doctors, and praying for more time. My hands felt cold. I continued scrolling. An attachment appeared beneath the email. One file. One document. Untouched. Unread. Waiting. The title sat there on the screen. Simple. Professional. Unassuming. Proposed transition plan. I stared at it for a long time. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Because for the first time I realized something that frightened me more than the second will. This wasn't merely secrecy. This wasn't simply avoidance. Someone had been planning something. And the planning had started before my husband was even gone. I moved the cursor toward the attachment. Then stopped. A strange sense of dread settled over me. Because deep down I knew whatever waited inside that document would change the way I saw the last several years of my life. And once I opened it, there would be no going back. I stared at the attachment for several seconds before opening it. My finger hovered above the trackpad. Part of me already knew I wasn't going to like what I found. Another part still hoped I was wrong. Hope is a stubborn thing. Even after disappointment. Even after betrayal. Even after evidence. Eventually I clicked. The document opened slowly. A simple title appeared at the top of the page. Family Transition Considerations. I read it twice. Then a third time. The title sounded harmless. Responsible even. The kind of document thoughtful families might create during difficult circumstances. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I had misunderstood everything. Then I started reading. The first page outlined general concerns. Future planning. Estate management. Household responsibilities. Financial coordination. Nothing alarming. Nothing dramatic. The language remained professional. Measured. Almost comforting. Then I reached the second page. And my stomach tightened. A heading appeared in bold. Housing options for Eleanor. I stared at it. Housing options. There it was again. My future reduced to a category. A discussion point. A subsection within someone else's plan. I scrolled slowly. Several possibilities followed. Remain in current residence. Downsize to a condominium. Move closer to family. Assisted living options if needed. Every suggestion appeared reasonable. Every suggestion appeared practical. And yet something about the entire section felt deeply wrong. Because nowhere did I find one thing. My opinion. Nobody had asked where I wanted to live. Nobody had asked what I hoped for. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to leave the house Thomas and I built together. They had simply begun discussing possibilities. As though my participation could be added later. If necessary. I leaned back in my chair. The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. Too small. I stood and walked toward the sink. Poured myself a glass of water. Then returned to the table. The document remained waiting. Patient. Unmoved. I continued reading. The next section was titled, Long-Term Responsibility Simplification. I frowned. Simplification. Another familiar word. Another harmless word. A word that seemed to appear whenever somebody wanted to make decisions on my behalf. The section explained methods for reducing future responsibilities. Administrative responsibilities. Financial responsibilities. Property responsibilities. Medical responsibilities. The language remained polished. Professional. Carefully neutral. Yet the more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. Because nobody seemed interested in preserving my independence. Only managing it. One sentence stopped me completely. Goal. Simplify future responsibilities and reduce stress exposure. I stared at it. Stress exposure. Such a clinical phrase. Such a distant phrase. As though grief could be managed through administration. As though loneliness could be solved through paperwork. As though a human life could be reorganized like a filing cabinet. I closed my eyes. And suddenly another image appeared. Not from the document. From memory. While these plans were being discussed, I had been sitting beside hospital beds. Measuring medication doses. Tracking blood pressure readings. Speaking with specialists. Sleeping in uncomfortable chairs. Watching the man I loved struggle for every additional month. I remembered nights spent awake listening to Thomas breathe. Not because I couldn't sleep. Because I was afraid he would stop. Remembered carrying insurance paperwork from room to room. Making appointment schedules. Learning medical terms I never wanted to learn. I remembered pretending to be strong because Thomas needed me to be. And while I was doing all of that, someone was discussing life after him. The realization hit me harder than anything else. Not because planning was wrong. Because of the timing. The emotional distance required to plan for a future that hadn't arrived yet. I returned my attention to the screen. Further down the page, another note appeared. Jacob expressed concern regarding his mother's stress levels and long-term well-being. I stared at the sentence, and unexpectedly tears filled my eyes, because I believed him. Even now, I believed part of him genuinely worried about me. That was what made everything so painful. Jacob wasn't a monster. He wasn't cold-hearted. He wasn't driven by hatred. Part of him truly thought he was helping. Somehow that made the consequences even sadder. Good intentions don't erase harmful outcomes. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. The next section mentioned communication strategies. My stomach tightened before I even finished the heading. Experience had taught me to distrust certain words. The notes confirmed why. Claire suggested reducing emotional complications by streamlining communication. I laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because the phrase sounded absurd. Streamlining communication. The kind of language corporations use during restructuring. The kind of language consultants use when discussing efficiency. Not families. Not grief. Not love. I reread the sentence, then translated it in my mind. Fewer conversations. Fewer questions. Fewer opportunities for disagreement. Less involvement. The realization settled heavily inside me. Perhaps nobody had intended cruelty. Perhaps they genuinely believed efficiency and protection were the same thing. But they aren't. Not always. Further down, another heading appeared. Future family gatherings. My pulse quickened. I kept reading. A recommendation followed. Smaller logistics group recommended for planning and coordination. I froze. Then read the sentence again. Smaller. Logistics group. A strange numbness spread through me, because suddenly dozens of memories made sense. Family events I learned about afterward. Changes in plans nobody mentioned. Schedules finalized before I knew discussions had even started. Birthday celebrations adjusted without consulting me. School events that somehow slipped everyone's mind. For years I had explained those moments away. People are busy. Life gets complicated. Everyone forgets things. And sometimes those explanations were true. But not all of them. Not anymore. I pushed my chair back and stood. The room felt suffocating. I walked toward the living room. Past the Christmas tree. Past Thomas's reading glasses. Past the photographs lining the hallway. The house seemed full of evidence now. Not evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Evidence of gradual exclusion. One omission. One assumption. One decision. Repeated often enough to become a pattern. I stood in front of a family photograph taken 4 years earlier. Everyone smiling. Everyone together. First glance it looked perfect. Now I noticed something else. Claire stood at the center. Jacob beside her. The grandchildren in front. I stood near the edge. Not excluded. Just repositioned. Exactly as Thomas had described. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It fades quietly. One omission at a time. I returned to the kitchen. The document remained open. Waiting. Near the bottom of the file, I found handwritten notes attached as scanned images. My pulse quickened. Martin had mentioned them. I opened the first image. Several handwritten comments filled the margins. Most were difficult to read. Then one sentence became clear. Eleanor will likely agree if approached gradually. I stopped breathing. For several seconds I simply stared. Gradually. As though I were a negotiation. Project. Transition process. Not a person. Not a wife. Not a mother. Gradually. The word hurt more than I wanted to admit. Because it suggested something larger than planning. It suggested strategy. A plan for obtaining agreement rather than seeking it honestly. I leaned back slowly. My eyes never left the screen. Then my phone rang. Martin. I answered immediately. Martin. His voice sounded serious. Have you finished reading? Most of it. Silence. Then. There's a section you haven't seen. I frowned. What section? The handwritten notes. I just finished reading them. Another pause. Longer this time. Not all of them. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? The scanned version excludes one page. The room suddenly felt colder. Why? Because I wanted to discuss it first. I gripped the phone tighter. Martin. His voice lowered. Eleanor, those notes weren't written by Claire. For a moment I forgot how to speak. Forgot how to think. Everything inside me seemed to stop. The silence stretched between us. Finally I managed one question. Then who wrote them? Another pause. Then, your husband. I closed my eyes. The kitchen disappeared. The house disappeared. Everything disappeared except that answer. My husband. Thomas. The man I trusted most. The man whose handwriting I recognized instantly. The man whose letter sat folded on my kitchen table. The man who spent 42 years loving me. His handwriting. Inside a plan that now terrified me. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. Because the last thing I expected was to find my husband's own words buried inside a document that seemed to explain so much of my pain. And suddenly I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I spent the rest of the evening staring at my husband's handwriting. The scanned notes remained open on my laptop. The letter Thomas had written sat beside it. And somewhere between the two, the story I thought I understood began changing shape again. Outside, darkness pressed against the windows. The Christmas tree lights reflected softly across the room. The house felt impossibly quiet. I couldn't stop looking at the handwriting, the loops in the letters, the way he crossed his T's, the slight slant that appeared whenever he wrote quickly. It was unmistakably Thomas. Yet nothing about the situation made sense. If he had written some of the notes inside the transition plan, why did the document feel so wrong? Why did it seem so different from the man I had known for 42 years? I barely slept. By morning I was exhausted. When Martin called just after 10 I answered immediately. Neither of us bothered with small talk. Can you come by the office? He asked. I'm already getting my coat. 20 minutes later, I was back in the same conference room. The same table. The same folder. Only this time I felt less confused. And far more determined. Martin closed the door behind him, then sat across from me. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally I broke the silence. Explain it. He nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. I leaned forward. The notes. The plan. Thomas's handwriting. Martin folded his hands, then carefully chose his words. Thomas wasn't creating a plan to remove you from your life. The sentence hit me immediately. Because somewhere deep down I had begun fearing exactly that. Then what was he doing? Martin looked directly at me. He was creating a plan to protect you if his health declined faster than expected. The room went silent. I sat back slowly. Suddenly everything felt different. Not resolved. Not clear. Just different. Martin opened the folder. Then turned several pages. There's an important distinction that got lost. What distinction? The difference between the original recommendations and later discussions. I frowned. Martin slid 2 documents toward me. Side by side. Read these. I lowered my eyes. The first document contained Thomas's notes. One line immediately caught my attention. Ensure Eleanor remains fully informed regarding all decisions affecting her future. I read it again. Then again. Fully informed. Not partially informed. Not protected from information. Fully informed. Martin pointed to the second document. A later meeting summary. A different line appeared. Reduce unnecessary stress exposure for Eleanor whenever possible. At first glance, the 2 statements seemed similar. Compassionate. Reasonable. But they weren't the same. Not at all. The first required inclusion. The second justified exclusion. I looked up slowly. The meaning changed. Martin nodded. Exactly. The realization settled heavily inside me. Not because someone had forged documents. Because intentions had been interpreted. Adjusted. Reshaped. Perhaps gradually. Perhaps unintentionally at first. Yet the result remained the same. The version of Thomas's wishes that survived after his death wasn't entirely his anymore. It had become something else. Something filtered through other people. Other fears. Other priorities. I looked down again. For the first time I saw the difference clearly. Thomas wanted involvement. Others focused on management.
Thomas emphasis de participation.
Others emphasized protection. The language sounded similar. The outcomes were not. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. One evening years ago, Thomas and I spent nearly 30 minutes choosing a restaurant. Not because the decision mattered, because he insisted on hearing everyone's opinion, including mine, especially mine. I smiled sadly. Thomas hated making decisions for people, even small ones. The idea that he would secretly create a future for me without my knowledge suddenly felt impossible, because it wasn't who he was. Martin interrupted my thoughts. There's something else. The phrase had become alarmingly familiar. I looked up. What now? Instead of answering immediately, he removed a separate document from the folder. Only one page. I noticed his expression immediately. Careful, measured, concerned. The way attorneys look when they know information will hurt. A page is missing. The words hung in the air. I stared at him. Missing? Yes. The room seemed to grow still. My pulse quickened. What kind of page? Martin leaned back. A page attached to the original planning documents. My stomach tightened. And it's gone. We've never located the original copy. The implications arrived immediately. Not because Martin said them, because he didn't. The silence said enough. I looked down at the table, then back at him. What was on it? Martin hesitated, long enough to make me nervous. Finally he spoke. I don't remember the exact wording. I waited. But I remember the purpose. My heart began pounding. What purpose? Martin's eyes met mine. It explicitly stated that no major decisions affecting you could move forward without your direct approval. The room went completely silent. I stared at him, not moving, not speaking, not breathing properly. Page. One missing page. One instruction. One protection Thomas specifically included. Gone. The realization felt almost physical, as though something heavy had settled directly on my chest, because suddenly countless events looked different. Not random, not unfortunate, different. That page had disappeared. Then the version of the plan everyone followed wasn't complete. It was incomplete, altered by absence. The distinction mattered a great deal. I looked toward the window. Snow drifted slowly through the air outside. Peaceful. Quiet, completely disconnected from the storm unfolding inside my head. After several moments, I asked the question lingering beneath everything else. Did Jacob know? Martin didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Eventually he spoke. I believe Jacob knew some things. Some things. The phrase felt painfully accurate. Not all. Not enough. Just enough. I closed my eyes briefly. Jacob. My son. The child who hated conflict. The teenager who apologized too often. The man who spent years avoiding difficult conversations. Suddenly another possibility emerged. One I hadn't fully considered before. Maybe secrecy had felt easier than honesty. Maybe each delay felt temporary. Maybe every postponed conversation seemed harmless. Until it wasn't. Until years passed. Until shame became part of the equation. The thought didn't excuse anything. But it explained something. And explanations matter. Martin slid another document across the table. An email. I immediately recognized Thomas's name. Sent from his personal account. To Jacob. Dated 6 months before his death. My pulse quickened. I began reading. Jacob, if anything happens to me, your mother must never be excluded from discussions affecting her future. Never assume silence means agreement. Ask her. Include her. Listen to her. Promise me that. The words blurred for a moment. I blinked rapidly, then read them again. And again. There it was. Simple. Direct. Impossible to misunderstand. Thomas had not been vague. He had not been subtle. He had not left room for interpretation. He had told Jacob exactly what he wanted. I looked farther down. My breath caught. Jacob had replied. There it was. His response. His acknowledgement. His promise. My chest tightened, because this wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't memory. This wasn't interpretation. It was evidence. Jacob received the email. Jacob opened the email. Jacob answered the email. Yet somehow I spent the next 2 years sitting outside conversations I should have been part of. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because it proved wrongdoing. Because it proved awareness. Martin remained silent while I absorbed it. Eventually I looked up. What about Claire? The question emerged quietly. Not accusing. Just tired. Martin considered his answer carefully, then handed me another email. I read it slowly. One sentence stood out. We need consistency moving forward. Claire. Again. Consistency. Another perfectly reasonable word. Another word that somehow always resulted in less space for me. Less information. Less participation. Less voice. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Not because of one email. Because of all of them together. I leaned back. Exhaustion settled over me. Not the exhaustion of grief. Not the exhaustion of age. The exhaustion of finally seeing something clearly after years of uncertainty. For weeks I had been searching for answers. Now I wanted something else. Not revenge. Not punishment. Accountability. The distinction mattered. I wasn't interested in destroying anyone. I wanted the truth acknowledged. The silence acknowledged. The choices acknowledged. The consequences acknowledged. Nothing more. Nothing less. Martin closed the folder. There is one person who can explain what happened. I already knew the answer. Still I asked. Who? Jacob. The room fell silent. My son. Not the documents. Not the meetings. Not the missing page. Jacob. Because ultimately the second will wasn't hidden by accident. It wasn't misplaced. It wasn't forgotten. It was a decision. Maybe a fearful decision. Maybe a misguided decision. Maybe a decision made 1 week at a time. But a decision nonetheless. I looked out the window again, watching snow drift across the parking lot. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I stopped wondering what had happened. The evidence had answered that question. Now another question remained. A much harder one. Why? And I knew there was only one person left who could answer it. I asked Jacob to come alone. No lawyers. No documents. No Claire. Just the two of us. Mother and son. When I called him that morning, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he quietly said, "Okay." Nothing more. No questions. No excuses. No attempt to postpone the conversation. Part of me appreciated that. Another part wondered whether he already knew what was coming. We agreed to meet at my house that evening. The same house where he had taken his first steps. The same house where Thomas and I raised him. The same house that had somehow become the center of so many conversations I was never invited to join. I spent most of the afternoon cleaning. Not because the house needed it. Because I needed something to do. Grief had taught me that busy hands often make difficult thoughts easier to manage. I vacuumed, dusted shelves, rearranged books, then rearranged them again. By 5 o'clock, everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. At 6:40, headlights appeared in the driveway. Jacob was early, just like his father always was. That realization hit me harder than I expected. For a brief moment, I saw Thomas stepping out of the car instead. Then reality returned, and my son walked toward the front door. Alone. I opened it before he knocked. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us knew how. Mom. Come in. His voice sounded tired. Mine probably did too. He removed his coat and followed me into the kitchen. I had made coffee. Neither of us seemed interested in drinking it. The mug sat between us untouched. Steam rose briefly before fading. Eventually even the coffee seemed to give up waiting. The silence felt older than the room. Not hostile. Not angry. Heavy. The weight of years settling between two people who suddenly realize they had been living inside different versions of the same story. Jacob stared at his cup. I stared at him. The gray near his temples seemed more noticeable tonight. He looked older than he had on Christmas Eve. Or perhaps guilt simply ages people faster. Finally, I spoke. One word. The only word that mattered. Why? Jacob closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked softly. A car passed outside. The refrigerator hummed. Life continued, waiting for his answer. When it finally came, his voice sounded almost defeated. At first I thought I was helping. The response surprised me. Not because of what he said, because of how much he sounded like someone trying to convince himself. Helping who? He stared into his coffee. You. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it hurt. The explanation sounded so familiar. Protecting. Helping. Simplifying. Managing. Different words. The same result. You hid a will from me. My voice remained calm. You attended meetings without me. Still calm. You allowed conversations about my future to happen behind closed doors. A pause. Help me understand how that helped. Jacob rubbed a hand across his face. The gesture looked painfully familiar. Thomas used to do the same thing when searching for the right words. Dad trusted me. I remained silent. He continued. When he got sick, he started asking me to handle things. His voice cracked slightly. Paperwork. Appointments. Insurance issues. Meetings. I listened. Not because I agreed. Because I needed to understand. He trusted me to help. The sentence hung between us. Heavy. Complicated. Painfully human. And I kept telling myself I was honoring that trust. I looked down at the table. Then back at him. By ignoring what he specifically asked you to do. The question landed harder than I intended. Jacob flinched. Good. Not because I wanted revenge. Because truth should sting sometimes. Especially when people spend years avoiding it. I know. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I know. Silence returned. Not comfortable silence. Not peaceful silence. The kind that appears when both people recognize there are no easy answers left. Eventually Jacob spoke again. This didn't happen all at once. I nodded slowly. I already knew that. Nothing about this story happened all at once. Then tell me how it happened. For a long moment he stared at the kitchen window, watching snow drift beneath the porch light. When he finally answered, his voice sounded tired. Claire kept saying you were overwhelmed. I felt my chest tighten. There it is, I thought. The name neither of us had wanted to say. Jacob continued. She said you had enough stress. A pause. That you didn't need more. Another pause. That we should handle things for a while. For a while. Such a small phrase. Yet somehow it became years. I looked down at my hands. The same hands that sat beside Thomas during chemotherapy treatments. The same hands that signed hospital paperwork. The same hands that somehow became too fragile for information. The irony wasn't lost on me. When did a while become 2 years? Jacob swallowed hard. I don't know. The answer sounded honest. Painfully honest. Because sometimes people don't notice the moment temporary becomes permanent. They simply keep postponing difficult conversations until the delay itself becomes a habit. I studied my son carefully. The little boy was gone. The man remained. A flawed man. A frightened man. A man who made choices. The distinction mattered. Did you ever intend to tell me? The question escaped before I could stop it. Jacob immediately looked away. For several seconds he didn't answer. Then, yes. Silence. Another long silence. Finally, every week. The words hit me harder than I expected. Every week. Not never. Not intentionally forever. Every week. The admission felt tragic. Because I believed him. Not completely. But enough. Then why didn't you? His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Not fear. Not defensiveness. Shame. Because every week it became harder. The honesty in the answer took my breath away. No excuses. No blame. No elaborate explanation. Just shame. Growing quietly. Week after week. Year after year. Until the truth became too large to carry. I looked toward the empty chair beside the kitchen wall. Thomas's chair. The one nobody used anymore. And suddenly I realized something. It wasn't greed that broke my heart. It wasn't even the secrecy. It was realizing my son had repeatedly chosen comfort over honesty. Again. And again. And again. For years. The realization hurt more than any missing document. Because documents can be recovered. Trust is harder. Much harder. Eventually I asked another question. The meeting after your father's funeral. Jacob's shoulders immediately stiffened. I noticed. So you remember it. He nodded. Slowly. Painfully. I remember. The room felt colder. What happened? His eyes dropped toward the table. For a moment I thought he might refuse to answer. Then he surprised me. I should have invited you. The words were simple. Yet they carried enormous weight. Because hearing the truth and hearing it admitted are not the same thing. One informs. The other heals. At least a little. Not enough. But a little. I closed my eyes briefly, allowing the admission to settle, allowing myself to feel it. Not just intellectually. Emotionally. When I opened them again, Jacob was staring at his hands. I kept telling myself there would be time later. He laughed softly. A bitter laugh. There always seemed to be a reason to wait. I didn't respond, because I understood. Not the decision. The psychology. People rarely wake up and choose betrayal. More often they choose avoidance. Repeatedly. Until avoidance becomes betrayal. Jacob looked up. For the first time all evening he met my eyes directly. Claire influenced me. The admission arrived quietly. No anger. No blame. Just truth. Then he added something that surprised me. But she didn't make the decisions. A pause. I did. The room went silent. Because accountability sounds different from excuses. You can hear the difference immediately. For several minutes neither of us spoke. No shouting. No accusations. No dramatic confrontation. Just grief. The kind that arrives when the truth finally enters a room. Eventually I asked one final question. One I had been carrying since Christmas Eve. Does Claire know we're having this conversation? Jacob looked away. That answer told me everything. The silence lasted only 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Yet it felt longer. Because silence communicates things words often cannot. He hadn't told her. Or perhaps he had. Either way, he was afraid of the answer. And that alone revealed plenty. The conversation continued for another hour. Details. Clarifications. Painful acknowledgments. But the essential truth remained unchanged. Jacob had known. Jacob had waited. Jacob had hoped the problem would somehow solve itself. Life rarely works that way. Eventually he stood. The coffee remained untouched. The room felt emotionally exhausted. Like both of us had been carrying something heavy for too long. Jacob picked up his coat. I walked him to the front door. For a moment neither of us moved. The porch light cast long shadows across the snow. Then he spoke. Mom. I looked up. His face had gone pale. Not from fear. From effort. The effort required to finally tell the truth. He swallowed hard. There's something I never told Martin. My stomach tightened immediately. A familiar feeling now. What? Jacob looked away. Then back at me. The second will wasn't the only thing I hid. The words hung between us. Cold. Sharp. Unavoidable. Neither of us spoke. The wind stirred snow across the driveway. Somewhere down the street, a door closed. Life continued. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. Jacob stepped outside. Then paused. As though he wanted to say more. Instead he simply nodded. And walked toward his car. I stood in the doorway until the headlights disappeared. Only then did I close the door. The house felt different somehow. Not lighter. Not heavier. Just different. Because for the first time since Christmas Eve, I understood why the second will had remained hidden. But as I leaned against the door and replayed Jacob's final words, another realization settled over me. The story I had spent weeks uncovering still wasn't complete. And whatever secret remained, it frightened my son enough to hide it even from the lawyer. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, because I was thinking. For weeks I had been chasing facts. Documents. Emails. Meeting notes. Signatures. Missing pages. Hidden correspondence. But facts only explain what happened. They don't explain people. And somewhere between Christmas Eve and now, I had realized that understanding people was far more difficult. The house was quiet when I came downstairs the next morning. A pale winter sun filtered through the kitchen windows. The coffee maker sputtered to life. The same sound. The same routine. Yet everything felt different. I found myself staring at Thomas's empty chair. Not with sadness this time. With curiosity. What exactly had he seen? How much had he understood? And why had he felt the need to prepare for something like this? Around noon, a car pulled into the driveway. I looked through the front window. Jacob. When I opened the door, I immediately noticed the box in his hands. Old, brown, dust-covered. My stomach tightened. I recognized it instantly. It had belonged to Thomas. For years, it sat on the top shelf of his study closet. I hadn't seen it since before his illness became serious. Jacob stood silently on the porch. The box seemed heavier than it should have. Not physically. Emotionally. "Can I come in?" I nodded. Neither of us mentioned the weather. Neither of us pretended this was a normal visit. Some conversations are too important for small talk. We carried the box into the living room. The Christmas tree was gone now. Packed away. Only a faint indentation in the carpet remained. The holiday had ended. The questions had not. Jacob carefully placed the box on the coffee table. For several seconds, neither of us touched it. Finally, I looked at him. "What is it?" His eyes remained fixed on the box. "Dad gave it to me 6 months before he died." The room felt suddenly smaller. He asked me to keep it safe. I stared at him, then at the box, then back at him. A question immediately formed. The obvious question. The painful question. "If he gave it to you?" My voice was calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jacob lowered his eyes. For a moment he looked very young. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a child caught holding something he never should have hidden. "Because I was afraid." The answer surprised me. Not because it sounded dishonest. Because it sounded completely honest. "Afraid of what?" He exhaled slowly. What was inside? Silence settled between us. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Yet somehow I understood it. Fear had already explained so much. Fear of conflict. Fear of consequences. Fear of difficult conversations. Fear had quietly shaped years of decisions. Now it sat between us again. I reached forward, slowly, carefully, and opened the box. The scent hit me immediately. Old paper, dust, faint traces of Thomas's study. The smell transported me backward in time. For a brief moment, I could almost see him sitting behind his desk, reading, writing notes, adjusting his glasses, thinking, always thinking. Inside the box sat several folders, a handful of notebooks, letters, legal documents, personal notes. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just the accumulated records of a man preparing for uncertainty. I picked up the first letter. My name appeared on the envelope. The handwriting instantly tightened my throat. Even now, even after everything, seeing Thomas's handwriting still felt like hearing his voice. I unfolded the pages and began reading. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, then communication has failed somewhere along the way." I stopped. Read it again. Communication. Not money. Not inheritance. Not property. Communication. The distinction mattered. Changed everything. For weeks I had viewed this story through the lens of documents. Thomas viewed it through the lens of relationships. I continued reading. Families survive mistakes. They survive grief. They survive disagreements. What they struggle to survive is silence. My eyes blurred, because suddenly the entire story felt painfully simple. Not easy. Not small. Simple. Silence. Silence after the funeral. Silence about meetings. Silence about the second will. Silence about decisions. Silence about intentions. The damage had not come from one event. It had come from years of withheld conversations. I looked up briefly. Jacob sat quietly across from me, waiting, listening, perhaps hearing his father's words the same way I was. I returned to the letter. Claire likes structure. She likes certainty. She likes control. None of those qualities are inherently bad. In fact, they can be useful. But control without compassion can become something dangerous. I stared at the paragraph. Not because it shocked me, because it felt accurate. Thomas wasn't condemning Claire. He wasn't attacking her. He was observing her. The way he always observed people. Carefully. Honestly. Without cruelty. I thought about everything I had learned. The meetings. The plans. the communication strategies, the attempts to simplify, to organize, to manage. None of it came from hatred. Came from control. Control that slowly expanded until it occupied spaces where compassion should have remained. The realization felt important, because understanding someone's motives doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does explain it. An explanation matters. I continued reading. Jacob worries me in a different way. He avoids conflict. Always has. One day that tendency may cost him something important. I closed my eyes. A wave of sadness washed over me, because Thomas had been right. Not partially right. Completely right. Jacob's avoidance had cost him something important. My trust. His peace of mind. Years of honesty. Years we could never fully recover. Across the room, Jacob lowered his head. I wasn't sure whether he remembered those same words from childhood. Maybe he did. Maybe that was why he looked so tired. I continued reading. The next paragraph stopped me completely. Eleanor, if there is one thing I hope you remember, it is this. You are not a burden. You are not an obligation. You are not a problem to solve. You are not a responsibility to be managed. You are the center of this family. For several seconds I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't even blink. Because those words touched the wound underneath everything else. Not the meetings. Not the missing documents. Not the hidden will. The deeper wound. The fear that perhaps everyone saw me differently now. Older. Fragile. Inconvenient. A responsibility. Thomas had seen that fear. And answered it directly. Even from beyond the grave. A tear slipped down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I let it fall. Some grief deserves to be witnessed. Even when you're alone. Eventually I folded the letter closed. Neither Jacob nor I spoke immediately. The room remained still. Quiet. Heavy with understanding. Finally Jacob broke the silence. I kept waiting for the right moment. I looked up. His eyes were red. Not dramatically. Just enough. There wasn't one. His voice shook. Then I became ashamed. A pause. And shame made me hide even more. I believed him. Not because he deserved immediate forgiveness. Because the explanation fit everything I had learned. Shame grows in darkness. And darkness grows in silence. The cycle had fed itself for years. I leaned back slowly. The pieces were finally fitting together. Not perfectly, but enough. For weeks I had searched for a villain. Someone to blame. Someone to simplify the story. Life rarely offers that luxury. Instead, I found something harder. Complexity. Claire wanted certainty. Jacob wanted peace. Thomas wanted protection. I wanted family. Those motivations collided. And somewhere inside that collision, honesty disappeared. The betrayal had not happened all at once. It happened gradually. One omission. One assumption. One postponed conversation. One decision made on my behalf. Repeated often enough to become normal. Repeated long enough to become harmful. Repeated quietly enough that nobody stopped it. The realization was strangely freeing. Not because it removed responsibility. Because it clarified it. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to betray me. They simply kept choosing easier paths. Until the easier paths led somewhere painful. Jacob stared at the floor. Then finally looked up. Mom! His voice barely rose above a whisper. I waited. Can you ever forgive me? The question lingered in the room. Soft. Fragile. Human. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because the question deserved honesty. And honesty takes time. I looked toward Thomas's empty chair. Then back at my son. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what had happened. The meetings. The silence. The second will. The hidden documents. The missing years. The truth finally sat before me in complete form. The only question left was what I wanted to do with it. 3 months passed. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. The snow that had covered the neighborhood for months melted from the edges of driveways and sidewalks. Small patches of green began appearing beneath trees. Robins returned to the yard. The world, indifferent to grief and family conflict, continued moving forward. Whether I was ready or not. For a long time after my conversation with Jacob, I found myself noticing small changes. Not dramatic ones. Not the kind people post about online. The quieter kind. The kind that only matter because they are real. One morning, I realized I had gone an entire day without rereading Thomas's letter. Another afternoon, I found myself laughing at something on television and didn't immediately feel guilty afterward. One evening, I looked out the kitchen window and thought about the future instead of the past. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, small enough to miss if you're not paying attention. The house felt different too. Not because anything inside it had changed, because I had. Thomas's reading glasses still sat on the bookshelf. The photographs still lined the hallway. His old coffee mug still occupied the second shelf. He was still everywhere, just not in the same way. For a long time after his death, every object reminded me of what I had lost. Now they also reminded me of what I had been given. 42 years. A family. A life. A love story that remained real despite everything that happened afterward. One Saturday afternoon, Jacob came by. Not because I invited him. Not because he needed something. Just because he wanted to visit. That alone would have been unusual a year earlier. We sat on the back porch drinking coffee while spring sunlight filtered through the trees. The conversation drifted from weather to baseball to memories of Thomas. Simple things. Normal things. Then eventually the silence arrived. Not uncomfortable. Just necessary. Jacob stared into his cup. I knew what was coming before he spoke. Mom. I looked up. He swallowed. The same way he always did before difficult conversations. About what I asked. I nodded. 3 months earlier. Can you ever forgive me? Neither of us had forgotten. I set my coffee down carefully, then took my time answering. Because some questions deserve more than quick responses. Forgiveness isn't a single decision. Jacob remained silent, listening. It's a process. I looked toward the backyard, toward the flower beds Thomas built years ago. Some were blooming again. Others still needed work. The image felt strangely appropriate. Some days are easier than others. Jacob nodded slowly. His eyes never left me. I continued. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying anger. The words felt true. Not convenient. Not polite. True. For months I had carried enough grief to last several lifetimes. I wasn't interested in carrying bitterness too. That didn't mean everything was fixed. Far from it. I looked directly at him. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. The words landed heavily. It doesn't restore lost years. It doesn't make the secrecy acceptable. It doesn't make the meetings okay. A long pause followed. Then I added. It simply means I'm no longer willing to let it control my future. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jacob nodded. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Neither did I. Some emotions deserve honesty. Trust, after all, had been the thing missing from our family for too long. Claire and I remained polite, respectful even. But something fundamental had changed. Trust, once broken, rarely returns in its original form. People don't talk about that enough. They talk about forgiveness, about moving on, about second chances. What they don't mention is that relationships often survive in different forms than before. And that's okay. Sometimes healing means rebuilding. Sometimes healing means accepting limitations. Claire and I learned to exist somewhere in the middle. Neither enemies, nor particularly close. Just two women who finally understood each other more clearly than before. The clarity wasn't always comfortable, but it was honest. And honesty was worth more than comfort. Jacob changed too. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Real change rarely looks dramatic. He started calling more often. Showing up more often. Listening more carefully. Not because I demanded it. Because he finally understood that silence has consequences. One Sunday afternoon, he invited me to a family planning meeting. The phrase made me laugh. A genuine laugh. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. When I arrived, everyone was already seated around the dining table. Claire, Jacob, the grandchildren, a few other relatives. Someone asked where I thought the summer reunion should be held. And then something remarkable happened. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody translated my opinion into something easier. Nobody summarized my thoughts. Nobody decided what I meant before I finished speaking. I simply answered. And everyone listened. The moment lasted less than a minute. Yet it meant more to me than they could possibly know. For the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own family. Not managed. Not protected. Not simplified. Present. The victory wasn't dramatic. It was dignified, which made it far more meaningful. As spring turned toward summer, I found myself thinking about Thomas differently too. For months after his death, I remembered the illness, the hospital visits, the medications, the fear. Now other memories returned. Road trips, arguments over directions, late-night conversations, Sunday mornings, the ordinary pieces of a shared life, the pieces illness couldn't erase. Sometimes I still heard his voice, not literally, but in the choices I made, in the boundaries I kept, in the standards I refused to lower, in the respect I finally learned to demand. He remained part of me, not through grief, through wisdom. One evening, while organizing old photographs, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The second will, the hidden meetings, the missing documents, the unanswered questions. For months, I believed those things represented the greatest loss. I was wrong. The greatest loss wasn't the missing years. It wasn't the hidden conversations. It wasn't even the second will. The greatest loss was believing I needed permission to matter. I sat with that realization for a long time, because it explained something I hadn't fully understood before. For years, I had allowed other people to decide how much space I should occupy, how involved I should be, how informed I should remain, how much of a voice I deserved. Not because they forced me, because I trusted them. Trust isn't weakness, but trust without boundaries can become vulnerability. That lesson cost me dearly, yet it was still worth learning. I never needed permission to matter. I never needed approval to have a voice. I never needed someone else to define my place in the family I helped build. The truth had always been simpler than that. My dignity belonged to me. No document could grant it. No meeting could remove it. No secret could erase it. One Saturday morning near the beginning of summer, I sat alone on the back porch with a cup of coffee. Birds moved through the trees. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. The sky stretched bright and clear overhead. For the first time in a very long time, the future didn't feel frightening. It felt open. Not perfect. Not guaranteed. Not free from pain. Just open. And sometimes that's enough. I spent years believing family was something you protected at any cost. What I finally learned was this. Love requires honesty. Respect requires boundaries. And dignity is not something other people give you. It's something you decide to keep. Thomas understood that long before I did. Maybe that's why he left the letter. Not to protect me from documents. Not to protect me from mistakes. But to remind me who I was if I ever forgot. And in the end, that reminder became the greatest gift he ever left behind. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed the way you saw the people you loved? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, there are 2 more stories waiting on the final screen that might surprise you. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.